So, in summary, I'd like to see much greater commitment to changing the culture of the Parliament. I would change the way people sit. I would have people sitting as you are sitting, because it's a little bit hard if you're sitting at the same table as someone to shake your fist at them and say, you know, that they're hopeless, no good, and all the stuff that we see so often in question time. I've changed the way in which many more decisions were made in committee systems, and of course I've got a great deal of background in that in the Senate, because although I was a member of majority government, the majority government couldn't do everything it wanted simply because policy and legislation had to go through the Senate. And that's where we had our negotiation and learned to work with people, and just because they were on another side of the political divide, it didn't mean that they didn't have good ideas to contribute. Now, I know that many people will say, oh, Margaret, you know, that's really naive, but I do have some good examples where it worked. It worked for me, and I think it can work in a number of areas here in Tasmania. Here in Tasmania, we want to put disability on the political agenda. We tried in a variety of ways, and finally we were able to get a tripartisan agreement on disability priorities from the three political parties. We now have had a leaders' forum on some of the key issues, and that doesn't mean that there won't be criticism across the political parties, often deserved because of lack of action, but there is that general agreement that the three parties are committed to do more in terms of my now area of responsibility, Tasmanians with disabilities. So in summary, I think that it's not just a question about what happens if there is a formal power sharing arrangement in terms of the outcome of the next election. There should be power sharing, even when there is majority government. We have it, I guess, to a certain extent with the upper house. We'll hear more from Jim Wilkinson. But I think you can have it in the chamber itself. If we got rid of this idea that politics and debate is something of a blood sport, and instead replace it with serious negotiation, respect for one another's point of view, and then trying to come to a consensus. We won't always achieve that, but above all, trying to listen to the people and then trying to resolve those issues that invoke a lot of conflict. Thank you.
Impeccable timing. Thank you very much, Margaret. Now, Greg Barnes is well known to us as a Mercury columnist, but perhaps lesser known for his regular contributions to many other media outlets, probably too numerous to list here. But he's also, interestingly, as most of us know, a barrister, but a writer and a company director. He's a former advisor to New South Wales Premier Nick Greiner and Federal Finance Minister John Fay. He's also written 3 books on Australian politics, which should make him an adjunct of the School of Government, I would say. He ran the 1999 Republican referendum campaign. He practices law in Melbourne and Tasmania as a barrister specialising in criminal law and human rights, and he appeared in the 2008 Melbourne terrorism trial, which was the subject of a SBS documentary shown earlier this month. He's a legal advisor to prison action reform, a director of Australian Lawyers Alliance, and an ambassador for Beyond Blue. So I welcome Greg to the stand.
Well, thank you, Kate, and I'd like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land. I just want to talk a little bit about 3 things. Firstly, discuss the international experience, recent international experience in Canada, New Zealand and in Scotland in relation to power sharing of minority governments. I want to talk about why a Human Rights Act would bring about a greater sense of power sharing in any formal structures in government, and why you should get on that tram. And then I thirdly want to talk about the witch hunt legislation which has been passed in an unseemly haste through both houses of Parliament, in which the last 2 weeks, which trashes the rights of individuals to fairness in our legal system. Can I say firstly in relation to, can I firstly acknowledge one person who hasn't been acknowledged tonight as a candidate, David O'Byrne, my good friend from Labor candidate for Franklin, who does a better Paul Keating impersonation than me. Can I say in relation to Canada, it's emblematic of the fact that power sharing only works, minority governments only work when there's a culture that says they want to work. Canada doesn't work. Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister, has been in office since 2006. In the country, it's constantly on the edge of an election. Michael Ignatieff, the Liberal leader, is chafing at the bit to go to the polls. The NDP and the Bloc Québécois want to go to the polls. They formed a coalition last year, an aborted coalition, and tried to move a motion of no confidence. It has been effectively disastrous for Canada over the past 3 or 4 years. That's because each of those political parties believes in majoritarian principle. In the case of the Bloc Québécois, it doesn't believe in anything other than separation of Quebec from the rest of Canada. In relation to New Zealand, on the other hand, as I pointed out in my column on Monday, in New Zealand, it's fair to say that the MMP system, which no political party wanted when it was introduced in the mid-1990s, has been relatively successful in producing stable governments. Helen Clark was Prime Minister, I think, for 9 years. John King, the current Prime Minister, rules in a coalition. All parties have to rule in coalitions. And those governments have been fairly successful. What really matters, though, is the question of whether or not the rhetoric meets the reality. In Scotland in 2007, the Scottish Nationalist Party was elected in a minority government, the first minority government since devolution in 1997. And there was the promise of new politics. There was the promise of power sharing, there was the promise of collaboration. The reality has been very different to the rhetoric. And the way the SNP has been able to survive is by boosting its popularity by having its hands on the levers of government, and secondly, by effectively bypassing the Parliament, using the Parliament less to get its reforms through, doing things in an administrative sense, not using the vehicle of legislation, keeping away from the Parliament so that it doesn't run the risk of no confidence motions. A very good paper on this by Paul Canning from the University of Aberdeen, written only a number of weeks ago, essentially says that the long-standing culture or set of assumptions held by most parties in Scotland in favour of the value that the majority provides means that minority equates with instability, not opportunity. And that's effectively been what has happened in Parliament in Scotland. In other words, do not underestimate the difficulty of power sharing. In the context of Tasmania, about which Richard Herr has spoken, there does seem to be probably a greater opportunity than there was in 1989 because the Greens are now less fundamentalist and a more centrist party, as they are in Europe, and therefore more likely to be stable members of a coalition government. In Europe, in Germany, for example, we now have Greens in government in at least one land, one state, with a Conservative party, and mixing it with parties like the Free Democrats, which are effectively a liberal free market party. Can I now turn to the issue of extra-parliamentary activity, and can I turn to the issue of the Human Rights Act? I've been stunned in Tasmania at the lack of clamour for a Human Rights Act by the community. And if you want to see greater power sharing between the community and its parliament, then you need a Human Rights Act. Can I tell you that in Victoria, the Brumby government is held to greater account outside of the parliament than it is within the parliament by virtue of the Human Rights Act passed in that state by Australia's most progressive Attorney General Rob Hulls in 2004 or 2005. That legislation allows every individual in Victoria the right to assert in the court their legal rights. It has meant that the courts have been able to take on the role that they should take on in our democracy, and that is a check on the executive.